Hello and welcome to India Today Global. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is headed to Italy to attend the G7 leaders meeting. And of course, this is the first visit of his third term in office as Prime Minister. Joining us to understand what the implications of this trip will be and what India hopes to get out of the G7 meeting is Professor Amitabh Mattoo, who is Dean of the School of International Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Welcome, Professor Mattoo.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Shashank.
Thank you, sir. So, just to begin with, if you could give us a sense of what is expected to happen at this summit, what India is hoping to achieve at the G7 leaders meeting, just a basic sense of what's going on.
I mean, the G7 is the world's strongest economies. I mean, there isn't an organizational structure to G7, but it's a rotational presidency, and they have summit meetings, and they began meeting during President Nixon's presidency when and then the oil shock of 73 really provided the impetus for these economies to come together. And they are often described as a steering committee of the free world because these were actually northern economies or economies, capitalist economies, who also champion the values of liberal economics, but liberal policies and pluralism and democracy. And they have periodically had these outreach sessions where the G7 heads meet with a few other leaders who they think are important as part of a kind of wider steering committee for the rest of the world. And in this case, they've invited India, Brazil, Turkey, and the Emirates, from what I understand. And they're meeting at a particularly fascinating and fantastic town, Puglia, on the Adriatic coast, which I've had a occasion to visit, which is beautiful and breathtaking. So I'm sure that there is going to be business transacted, but it's also a time when these leaders, also called the free world, will have time to retreat, have informal conversations, and talk about the future of the world's problems, including the economy, but also other problems. And the agenda, the formal agenda, if you look at it, is fairly clear that you're going to talk about naturally the Ukraine war, right. And Zelensky has also been invited. Mm-hmm. And then you're going to talk about the Middle East, i.e., Gaza, and what's been happening there. Then you're going to talk about the Indo-Pacific, and that's really a code word for talking about how to, in some ways, contain Chinese influence. Right. Then there are issues like artificial intelligence, energy, climate change, and one issue which is a favorite of Meloni, Prime Minister Meloni of Italy, is Africa, right, which she wants to have talk about African development. But really, that's a euphemism for trying to see how Italy and the G7 countries and other like-minded countries can help Africa transition from its dependence on Russian oil to clean energy, but also perhaps in some ways helping to curb illegal migration. As you know, that's an issue for much of Europe and for the Italian Prime Minister as well. She and Prime Minister Modi have a chemistry. They've been there. They've met before, had long conversations, and Prime Minister Modi has expressed that by saying that he is delighted that this first visit of his third term is to Italy.
I understand. And if I could ask you, in terms of what India hopes to get out of this, India's, of course, been a almost regular guest attendee at the G7 for several years now. Is it that India hopes to steer the steering committee, to use a phrase that you used?
Yeah, I think it's a question of being part at the moment of the high table, so to speak, but you're really given initially you were perhaps not on the table itself, you were outside the table. Now you've got a place on the outer edges of the table, but hopefully India will be recognized in an expanded G7 as a full-fledged member of the steering committee for the free world, and as the voice, in some ways, as India has expressed it, the voice of the global South. Global South is, as you know, a nebulous entity, but in as much that there are voices which are not voices which sit on the table or which are heard when the leaders of the global North or the G7 countries speak, that is the kind of voice that India will hope to bring to that table. Of course, the problem is that many of the leaders who are assembling in Pugalia are the people who are besieged within. I mean, you have Biden fighting election in a few months against Trump, who seems to be, despite having the courts running after him, coming out stronger. And Biden seems, frankly, the last images that I saw of him is someone who is in frail health, if one can describe that again in euphemistic terms, because he seems stiff and not quite all there.
Right.
Macron is facing elections. Similarly, you have a situation where Rishi Sunak is besieged at home. Trudeau, the less said, the better. So all of in some ways, Meloni is the only one who's strong, other than Prime Minister Modi, who has just recently won an election, not with the kind of mandate that his supporters would have expected, but certainly arriving in Italy, re-elected as the prime minister of the largest democracy in the world.
Right. We've talked about the agenda, which ranges from the wars in the Middle East and in Ukraine. It has, economic problems, whether it's indebtedness of African countries. So really a massive agenda. But the question is the G7 up to it, right? You described how so many of these leaders are weakened domestically. And of course, there's always been a standing question about, in recent years, about whether multilateralism is what it used to be. Do you think that there is, especially for example on questions like China, there are divisions between America and their European allies on how best to go about dealing with this absolutely crucial strategic problem? So how do you suspect that the agenda is massive, but do you think that the G7 still has the bite to and the heft to make things happen?
I mean, I agree with you that G7 probably doesn't have the salience that it once did to be able to steer or navigate the world in a direction of its choice. Clearly, the rise of China is one great challenge to the G7's modus operandi. Similarly, even Russia is not an easy country to deal with. So the G7 doesn't have that salience, but also because the leaders themselves are fragile, but still as a forum with signals. They're not an executive making decision. I mean, they can't decide in Italy that we'll do this. But in terms of signaling, it's an important signal. So whatever communication comes out of the G7, whatever communique comes out, will signal to the international system, here are the strongest economies of the world, sans China and sans Russia, who are wanting to put this on the record. This is the next steps in terms of whether it's conflict resolution and ceasefire in Gaza, or whether it is ending the war in Ukraine, or a vision about Africa, or indeed in terms of artificial intelligence, both in terms of the possibilities as well as the challenges that AI presents itself, and other related issues like climate change and clean energy. So those signaling in today's international system, signaling is often as important as actual decision making at times, because it sets a trend, it creates a norm. Norm setting can be more important in the long term than merely quick instant fixes. For instance, on climate change, if there is a normative desire to cut down in emissions beyond 33 to 40%, is the G7 going to signal that again? Is there going to be a consensus? Because if that helps internalize that norm for practitioners, for the thinking community, and helps create a discourse. And as you're aware, often discourses can shape events very powerfully in perhaps more insidious ways than quick decisions.
I want to ask you a question about how India is going to be looking at this going into this meeting. Let me start with just the conflicts that you were mentioning. Israel and its war in Gaza. You also have the Russian war in Ukraine. Does India hope in some ways, to use the G7 platform to, in some ways, push for reconciliation or mediation or any role in that nature? Or how exactly does it intend to steer, do you think, in your opinion, the discussions on this?
obviously, India and the BJP in its foreign policy in its manifesto, and the Prime Minister and the External Affairs Minister have now talked about Vishwa Bandhu. India is a Vishwa Bandhu or a Vishwa, it was earlier Vishwa Mitra, a friend, but a friend with a great deal of compassion for the world and its problems. So I think India wants to position itself as a country with independent agency, with agency which it retains despite its proximity to the United States and to some of the other G7 countries, that it has a voice and that it's going to use that voice autonomously. Those who thought that India would, because of the rise of China, suddenly become a camp follower of the United States are mistaken. That we still would like to champion the causes which we think are right and which we think are in the Indian interest. So on the war in Ukraine, obviously, the West expected us to take a certain knee-jerk view of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We didn't. Not only because we have a historical bilateral relationship, long-standing relationship with Russia, but also because our interests would have been compromised if we had condemned Russia, particularly in terms of our energy interests. And more importantly, we wanted to signal that we're not going to be aligned. In some ways, non-alignment is seen as a bad word, but not the principal raison d'etre for non-alignment or the philosophical roots of non-alignment was precisely this, that we retain that right, we retain the high ground, moral high ground sometimes, but eventually we will develop policies in our own interest. Now, initially, people thought that that was a terrible policy. But now, today, India is seen increasingly as one country which could potentially mediate uh, in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. India is being represented not at the level of a minister, leave alone the prime minister. The summit or the Swiss meeting on Ukraine later this month by our secretary in the Ministry of External Affairs, Pavan Kapoor. So that's one other signal that we will be there on all forums, which will try and find a non-zero-sum resolution of the crisis in Ukraine. In Israel, in the case of the Middle East, I think our position initially was perhaps seen as being a little too pro-Israel, given our long-standing, or not long-standing, given our recent proximity to Israel. But I think that's become more nuanced as we have called for a ceasefire, and eventually also talked about how the rights of the Palestinian people and they should not be coalesced with the activities of a terrorist organization like Hamas. And the fact of that there is a huge civil humanitarian tragedy happening in Gaza, in Rafah, that needs to be recognized as well. So I think those positions have become more nuanced. And Prime Minister Modi sent NSA Ajit Doval, who I just heard his term has been extended, and rightly so, because I think he might be physically a senior citizen, but mentally, when I met him about last month, he was as agile and as sharp as ever. So I think it's a good decision to have the NSA. But more importantly, the point I was making, that the NSA went as a special envoy to try and convince or persuade Benjamin Netanyahu to have a ceasefire, especially during the month of Ramadan. It didn't work out. But India is making these small, important initiatives and signaling efforts which really makes India stand apart from the rest. India is not part of a crowd. India's voice is India's voice.
Right. And if I could ask you, you alluded to this a little bit, but if I could ask, you talked about how there were expectations, for example, that India's policy would hew more towards the West. In fact, I think at the India Today conclave, we had Fareed Zakaria recently, who came in and said that, it's unfortunate because he expected India, or at least would have liked India to sort of lock in much more with the West, using his phrase, to sort of access the full benefits of Western capital, technology, and so on and so forth. Do you agree with that argument? I was just curious. That
I take a long. I'm not a trained historian, but I have like to take a more telescopic view of events. rather than a microscope, rather than go into granular details of immediacy. And the telescopic view is that, India has been colonized, was colonized for 200 years. We lived to understand the West for the years under the Cold War, and we were there on the opposite side of the Cold War.
Right.
So we understand how American foreign policy or British imperialist policies were driven often by self-interest.
Right.
Show me a policy where they have acted against the self-interest in the pursuit of some normative ideal. When there was a real choice between the pursuit of self-interest, selfish self-interest, and high principles, they've always chosen for the latter, for the former, which is short-term or their own selfish interests. But they expect India to stand up for the normative ideals that they hold on occasion while compromising on its national interests. I don't think I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's right, no matter what Fareed Zakaria says. I respect him, and I respect the incisiveness that he brings in his commentary on international relations. But on this case, I think his positionality is such that he's part of the beltway of the Washington beltway. So his worldview is colored by having lived, been educated, and having worked in the beltway. I mean, in my discipline, it's important to know where you're coming from before you can judge what is being said.
Right. If I could understand something else, you talked about earlier when you gave this introduction, you talked about Justin Trudeau, and much of the conversation, at least among us media types, is about this sort of much rumored face-to-face meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Justin Trudeau. Of course, they may come face-to-face during the course of these meetings. And of course, there's been some questions about India's relationship with the West in the aftermath of the allegations that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau made about India's possible involvement in the assassination of Hardeep Singh Nijjar in September 2023. The Americans then followed that up with not so high profile an accusation, but nevertheless something they take extremely seriously about another such alleged plot on American soil. Do you think that something like that has an impact, when you combine it with things like, of course, Russia, Ukraine? Do you think things like that have an impact on strategic trust? Do you think that playing? Do you see that playing on what's happening at the G7? Do you think it'll play on the interactions between Prime Minister Modi and his Western counterparts at the G7?
I doubt very much. This is for the West, this was an irritant, but India is far too important for this irritant to derail bilateral relations. Canada can take a more high moral ground because its stakes are not the same as, say, the United States or the United Kingdom, United States particularly. So this is an incident which had a temporary impact in terms of the adverse publicity generated, and perhaps strengthened constituencies within the State Department, which have traditionally, institutionally been not pro-India. Remember that the State Department has cultivated its relationships with Pakistan for nearly 60 years with every arm of the Pakistani government. So there's a natural affinity towards Pakistan. And whenever India is seen as acting what they think is badly, they will overreact because they want to say, look, we told you so.
Right.
But I think all those who have a strategic view of international relations, and fortunately, the bulk of the White House and even the Biden administration, fragile as it may seem, takes a long-term strategic view of its relations with China. This one issue cannot be allowed, in even the people that I speak to Washington, in any way undermine relations, particularly when Prime Minister Modi is back. Now, it would have been a different ballgame if, for instance, for some reason, the BJP and the NDA would have lost. Then there is a certain kind of opportunism which prevails. Right. But that kind of opportunism is on the back burner and behind us now.
Right.
I doubt whether this will be even part of the conversation. And when Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Trudeau meet, as they will, I think there will be pleasantries. And the same kind of pleasantries, Prime Minister Trudeau may say bonjour, and Prime Minister Modi may take a day to respond by saying namaste to indicate that it's not business as usual. But beyond that, I don't think that will impact on the G7 or its atmospherics.
Right. And if I may ask another question, just to close off with, on China, and of course, India continues to have a difficult relationship with the Chinese. The border standoff remains in, if not all sectors, and certainly some sectors. And my question to you is, what is India hoping for in terms of going to the G7? There's going to be a conversation about China. There's going to be some economic conversations about China's economic policies on global markets. What do you think India is looking to get out of this conversation with Western countries and with the G7 on China policy? Is it looking for support? Is it looking to evolve a common approach? Do you think it's in line with some of the more aggressive moves we've seen out of the United States, with Jake Sullivan and, and the United States government pushing technology controls on China? Do you think, what is India looking for on China policy from the G7?
I think what has always been, since the COVID days, has been a degree of coordination, but at least a recognition that the over dependence on China for especially manufacturing goods will have to be changed, and that there has to be a diversification in terms of supply chain, and they have become resilient on their own. It's easier said than done, but I think the G7 countries and the invitees will try and again examine ways in which that can that India as an alternative destination for investment and also for manufacturing can be strengthened. Secondly, of course, India would like that its security concerns towards China. Remember that India, amongst all the countries that are there, shares a real border, a live border,
right,
where Chinese are constantly being troublesome at the very least towards India. And India would like that those concerns not only to be registered, but some degree of coordination in terms of how to respond to the real-time threat of China in the subcontinent, in the Indian Ocean, in the larger Indo-Pacific region.
And do you think that, just if I may ask, in terms of where we see European countries, where we see America, where we see India, do you think that these different forces are lined up in relatively the same position or relatively the same level of will to do something about China or to work together on China? Where do you think?
I think the Europeans will increasingly come around. They're hedging. They usually hedge because they have the space to hedge. They're neither a superpower nor a country nor a rising power. There are mostly has-been powers.
Right.
Has-been powers long separated by a great distance from the main theaters of conflict. So they will be continue hedging, but hopefully I think there will be a greater sensitivity to these concerns. What I'm curious about is how Turkey will behave itself in the G7 outreach meetings.
Right.
Let's see. I think that's one joker in the pack to watch out for.
Right. And in 2022, you have, of course, Prime Minister Modi meeting President Erdogan on the sidelines, I think, of the SCO summit. I believe it was in 2022. And, there was a sense of what are the two countries signaling with this. Of course, President Erdogan earned lots of notoriety in India with his support for Pakistan's position on Kashmir. And do you see something happening on that front with Turkey? Every time I meet the Central European division of the Ministry of External Affairs, they always say that Turkey is our major focus. But do you see anything positively moving forward?
People don't, students of international relations often disregard the importance of leaders, and especially strong leaders.
Right.
And strong leaders who can often make quick decisions, brave decisions, sometimes adventurous decisions. Erdogan, till recently, was a very strong leader of Turkey. Prime Minister Modi is still very strong, the strongest in the Indira Gandhi, Prime Minister of India. And anything is possible. If there's a new chemistry, a realization that let's put the past behind us, because no Turkey can make India change its position on Kashmir. And the sooner Turkey realizes that it should not let the relationship be derailed because of its attitude, and that there needn't be a zero-sum game in terms of its relations with Pakistan. Yes, sure, Turkey has had long-standing relations with Pakistan, but it must recognize that the importance of building relations with India. And if Erdogan realizes that, and Prime Minister Modi recognizes that it might be the wisest course to follow, anything could happen. That's what I said.
Right.
That the Sherpas and the South Bloc Mandarins will advise, suggest, but often leaders, strong leaders, can go off the script.
Right. And
And that is what we often expect. Otherwise, summits would become routine, boring photo ops, and there would be nothing to it.
Right.
You could have a robo instead of, or a hologram instead of an actual leader come there. In the days of AI, you might even be able to produce a real life person who thinks, acts like the leader. But the human flesh and the chemistry of leaders when they sit together is often something which can produce a reaction which no one can ever predict.
And Professor, then my last question to you is on the much anticipated meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. Could you give us a sense of how strange and interesting this is, that two countries that 10 years ago were dealing with the aftermath of the Augusta Western scandal as well as the Italian Marines case. Now, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni seems to be a phenomenon here on social media as well as more generally among the Indian public, of course, for a lighter-hearted reason. But do you think what do you make of it yourself?
I think the chemistry works beautifully there. I think Prime Minister Modi has clearly charmed Prime Minister Meloni and vice versa. So here's a situation where 10 years ago you would have thought Italy, Rome and New Delhi look in different directions.
Right.
And today you have two leaders, different backgrounds, but with a powerful chemistry, which can bring these two nations together. And they make a a fantastically attractive photo opportunity as well for all those who are there. I would like to be a fly on the wall. Unfortunately, I'm in JNU in New Delhi, far away from the exciting things that are happening on the Adriatic coast.
But on that note, we do have our Foreign Affairs editor, Geeta Mohan, on the ground in Italy. But of course, I will have to bring you her dispatches later. Thank you so much for your time, Professor Mattoo, for your time, for your expertise. That's it from us on this edition of our G7 coverage. We will be absolutely sure to bring you the latest coverage moving forward. Thank you so much for watching India Today Global.